Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for our webinar, Find Your Champion, How Gamification in Tournaments Reduce Risk and Build Security-Focused Software Developers. Today's talk will be hosted by globally recognized security expert and Secure Code Warrior CEO and co-founder, Peter Danhue. Before we start, just a reminder that you can submit questions in the chat box and we will answer as many as we have time for during our question and answer session after the presentation. We will also be sending out a full recording after the webinar is complete. Thanks again for joining us, and with that, I'll hand it over to Peter.
Thank you. I am really excited about this. Now, as a bit of a background about myself, I've been in the cybersecurity AppSec space since early 2000s. I've worked for the SANS Institute, training a lot of people. I've been an entrepreneur. I founded Inviso and now also Secure Code Warrior, but I've also been contributing to the community by being one of the co-founders of the hacking conference BrewCon in Europe, and also something called the Hex Factor, which I'm going to talk about today as well. Now, I was going to talk about the gamification and how it can actually help you building an effective training program. Now, before we kind of do that, I want to take you through what we're going to look at. So first of all, I want to step you through how gamification kind of evolved from the early 1900s until today and how it's being used in organizations. The second point I want to talk about is what are we currently doing in security training, and why does most security training doesn't really work and doesn't really engage. Now, I also want to give you some tips on how can you now actually empower the developers. I will talk about something that we call tournament mode, but also talk a little bit about what security champions are, how to find them, what typical profile they are, and then at the end we have some time for questions. Now, I'm going to get started to talk about gamification through time. Now, you're not going to believe this, but the first instance of gamification was actually somewhere around the 1900s. Now, it was invented by a company called Sperry and Hutchinson's, and they basically started offering loyalty stamps in the early 1900s. Now, loyalty stamps today is a very well-known concept, but they basically came out with those stamps whenever you went to a retail shop and you were buying stuff. They basically gave you points. You could then paste those points into a little booklet, and with that booklet, you could then start buying stuff on in their shop. So it clearly shows you, hey, you're doing something that we like as a customer. We give you some points, and as a reward, we give you some stuff from our shop as well. And this was really one of the first examples on how gamification and the usage of game-based elements was helping to drive loyalty, was helping to drive engagement. Now, jumping forward in time, there are basically around 96, so just before the year 2000, they were the first capture the flags that were being organized. Now, of course, in the 80s and 90s, you had games that were coming up. Nintendo was bringing out game consoles. So the whole concept of gaming became very popular with people. And one of those concepts that was quickly being picked up by the security community was something called capture the flags. Now, in 96, there was basically a hacking conference in the US, DEF CON 4. It was one of the first gamified hacking contests. So what basically happened is they invited a whole bunch of security people into a room in Las Vegas, and they started to build these hands-on practices on how to teach people how to hack into systems. And if they basically succeeded into hacking into systems, they were points that were being rewarded to the different teams. Now, important here is to realize the action is we're going to train people on how to break into systems. The reward is that we're going to give them points, but also it is being done in a team of 4 or 5 people. So it has that team aspect, it has that collaboration aspect, which I'm going to talk about later as well. Now, then moving on, rewards and reputation, 2004. Now, online gaming became a very popular thing. Now, one of the most successful games was probably World of Warcraft. The good thing in that World of Warcraft, it wasn't only about gaining points and gaining strengths, but you also, by playing online, you were playing in teams online against other people, and you were gaining reputation. You got certain levels in World of Warcraft, and suddenly you can get a certain status in a community of gamers. And you will see that that sense of community is one of the big drivers behind a successful gamification program as well. Is that you're achieving status, you are gaining rewards, but you're also are forming part of a sort of team and a community. Now, it was also adopted in the corporate world. I think one of the most successful stories that was published was 2016. Microsoft, they decided to gamify the performance within their call center. So they basically wanted all their customer support people. They wanted to encourage them, encourage the productivity, and the way on how they were trying to do that is by giving them rewards, challenges, but also recognition. So Microsoft implemented this program where whenever somebody was issuing a certain resolution within a certain amount of time, that call center person got a reward. He got points for doing that. They also gave out rewards for sales performance, and then they basically recognized that performance of the best performing call center in the organization. Now, what I found very interesting when I read the paper about Microsoft is that they didn't only reward people for doing the right actions, but they were also rewarding people for what is now called micro-learning. And what they're basically doing is in between customer calls, when you fixed one customer issue, in between, they were giving the call center people 3 to 4 minute small learnings about a simulation of what could go wrong in the customer call. So were they kind of embedding learning on the job training? They were embedding it in basically the daily life of one of those customer success people. And to me, that is really important. Is when you start rolling out training, is that we need to try and embed this in between the work of people, so that it becomes more of a daily thing instead of a one-off learning. So that was a great example where gamification kind of worked, and I know Microsoft has now built that into their Microsoft Dynamics product as well. Now, the one that inspired me was actually Pokemon Go. And no, I didn't play Pokemon Go myself, but I was actually surprised that in 2016, when we were already building Secure Code Warrior, I saw this hype that was going around viral over the internet, which was called Pokemon Go. Now, the amazing thing that I thought about Pokemon Go is that everybody started installing that app on their phone. There were about 800 million subscribers. Now, what was their secret sauce? Well, they had this this virtual or augmented reality where you could see animals in the wild, and people were actually chasing them on the streets, going to locations, taking pictures, and throwing these Pokemon balls to those animals. And the only thing they got out of it was basically points and status and recognition. And that example of Pokemon Go really showed me that if you use the right techniques in the right environment and you make it easy for your end users, you will actually move people and you will actually have them go out, do physical activity, and just because they are chasing the competition, they are chasing the points and they're chasing the status and the recognition. So the last example that I basically wanted to talk about as well before moving on is that basically the Republic of China is working on a behavioral system. It is a gamified initiative called the social credit system. Now what they're going to do is they're going to reward but also penalize citizens based upon what they do in their everyday behavior. So if you, for example, you got a good credit rating system, or you're not buying alcohol in a shop, or you haven't been caught by the police for speeding, you would actually get points in this social credit system. Now, as some examples, what they're doing, if you are having a very poor score, you could get a travel ban, you're going to be excluded from schools. And the worst thing of all is they could slow down your internet connection so Netflix doesn't work anymore, if it doesn't even work in China. But that is just an example of a mass gamified environment that is used to stimulate the right behavior in a society. Now, I don't think it's live yet. I think there's a lot of talks about this system, but there is a plan to kind of have this system in an app and have it online by the year 2020. Now, why do all these examples basically work? What's the secret sauce behind gamification? Why are people so excited about gamification? Well, when thinking about the subject, it's really a combination of 3 or 4 things. Step 1 is basically you need to convince the person to take an action. You need to have him chase a Pokemon Go, or you basically need to have them come in your store and buy something. And then because the person takes that action, you want to reward them, you want to incentivize them. Now, rewards could be in points, could be in achievements, could be in certificates, could be in badges. So you're basically rewarding something, you're giving something to the end user. And as a result of that reward, you will typically invoke an emotion. You will trigger the dopamines. You are basically going to make people happy, because if you give somebody points, it gives him the good feeling that he has basically achievement. But sometimes it could also lead to a status and or even being part of a community. So to just give a quick example, let's say there's a trip site where you can give reviews about restaurants. Now, if I'm a company and I want my users to write review, to take 5 minutes to actually write a review on a trip site, well, I could basically, if the user gives me that review, I can give them points, and the emotion is basically he likes getting points. You have this dopamine flowing, and they're basically happy that they're seeing their points going up. Now, if you reach a certain points, you can then start elevating his status and making him from a bronze, you can have him go to a gold, or from a gold to an elite status. It's a technique which is being used by frequent flyers day in, day out. Now, another thing that that is accomplished by writing these reviews is that the person actually has the feeling he has contributed to the world of travels. He has done something for the community, which is really important. And also personally, he thinks he's doing something right by helping the hotel or the restaurant that he actually wrote the review to tell him, hey, saying, hey, I think this is really good, or hey, I think this could basically improve. And all those elements need to be there, because if you just give out points but without the action, well, you are not going to have a result of or a consequence of achievement. Or if you ask the action and you just give him status, but you're not actually rewarding the person by points, then it's not going to have the same effect. The community aspect is really important as well, because let's say you have a kind of a status program and you can move up from gold to bronze to silver, but it doesn't have any effect on how the person is being treated, or it doesn't have any effect on how people actually view that person within the community, or there's no community at all, then of course it doesn't have the same effect. And I think that's why sites like LinkedIn, they work very well, because there's a community aspect where you can see the achievement of the certain user. So that's basically a little bit about gamification and what are the critical elements. And I'll come back to these elements later on when we're actually talking about effective security training or secure coding training for developers. Now, if we kind of look at the current state of security training, very often the approach we've been taking in the past 20 years is that security training for developers and security training in general, think about awareness training as well, it has always been driven by some mandatory online compliance stuff. And nobody likes doing these trainings that you can just click through and they're just, you need to complete them once a year, and once you've completed them, you're off the hook and you can go back doing your own job. Now, many organizations have basically implemented that because it's the only way on how you can kind of get force people to do things and say, hey, it needs to be mandatory, it is compliance for this and these regulations, and we are going to measure if this training was actually effective by A, have you watched the video completely, and B, we're going to ask you a quiz at the end to see if you actually retain some knowledge. Now, of course, nobody likes doing these kind of trainings, and developers especially, they don't doing that stuff because it is just not engaging, it's just not hands-on enough. Now, other things I've seen is how are we delivering those trainings? Very often, if you have a large user base, the only options you have is you either use e-learning or videos, or you use classroom training. Now, downsides of both of them is that, well, with e-learning and videos, it is a lot about clicking and reading and theory, and it's not really interactive. I haven't seen any videos that I can kind of think of like, hey, yes, I'll actually spend my spare time, or I spend my weekend watching this stuff and learning about secure coding training, because nobody learns stuff by looking at videos or by reading text. It's like saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to teach you how to drive with a car. And if you want to know how to drive with a car, here's a YouTube video that's going to explain you how a car basically works and how to drive the car. Nobody has ever learned how to drive with a car by actually watching videos. It's actually by sitting in the car, taking the car on a parking lot, driving, test driving, that you are gaining the skills and gaining the experience. There's also classroom trainings. Now, the delivery of classroom trainings, it could be variable quality. Some are really good, some are really bad. It really depends on your instructor. So there are very good classroom trainings out there that you can get. Now, the main issue I find with classroom trainings is that it doesn't scale well if you have 500 developers. Because if you need to run either a classroom of 500 developers, it is going to be either really generic, or you can't really interact with every single person if there's 500 in your room. Now, you could say, well, let's schedule in a session every single day, but and then let's do 25 users in a classroom and basically schedule in 20 days, a full month of delivering classroom training on how to teach them about secure coding. Now, first of all, it's a very expensive exercise, and the main thing I've noticed as well is that you're taking people away from their day job. They have to spend like a full day in your class being focused, and there's all these other pressures that are building up and deliveries that they need to make, that it often doesn't really work very well if you want to teach large group of people within the organization. Now, the last thing is up to date, I've seen content in security training that it is very generic and is one size fits all. We are giving front-end developers, mobile developers, back-end developers, we're giving them all the same secure coding training. And because it needs to be applicable to all of them, what usually happens is that you make an abstract and you make something which is applicable to all of them. So you make it generic. And you talk about input validation, but you're not really going into the depth, and it's the depth and the technical details that are actually really important in this kind of a training. So the content is usually very generic. The other mistake I've seen making is that people, they want to make developers in security experts, and let's say they've managed to secure 3 or 4 hours in a day to teach developers about security. They're going to cram in the whole WASP top 10, talking about, hey, what are injection attacks and how does it work and how to exploit it, move on to the next one, cross-site scripting and how does it work and how to prevent against it. But what you're actually trying to do is you're trying to cram in so much knowledge in 3 or 4 hours that any developer that kind of sits and looks at the training completely loses focus and won't be able to grasp what you're trying to teach them, because we're trying to push too much security knowledge to those groups. And then the last thing is that it's very difficult to measure effectiveness of training. Typically, it's being measured by, have you completed the training, or here's a little quiz where I'm going to ask you a question and give you 4 options. And that's the only way on how, at the moment, we've been able to say, hey, have you actually learned something out of this thing? Now, why do I think do we need to have security training for developers that's really effective? Now, let me give you an example. There's a lot of organizations, they've implemented everything that starts with an alphabet letter and ends on AST: application security testing, static code analysis, dynamic code analysis, and all these kind of tools, which is really good if you have those tools in the organization. Now, typically they are being run by people that know security. They test it and they basically find vulnerabilities. Now, the next step is that those security people, they are loading the results into Jira, into a bug tracking system, and they're basically saying to the developer, saying, hey, we found a vulnerability in your application. It is a cross-site scripting. You basically need to fix this ticket, and I'm assigning you this ticket, and it's a high-risk vulnerability. You need to fix it within 48 hours. Now, of course, the smartest developer in the group, he jumps on that ticket. He finds a way on how to find the problem. He looks at OWASP, or he looks online. He reads guidance, and he basically finds a way on how to fix this vulnerability in his Java Spring code. He basically submits, resolves the ticket, submits the commit, and the vulnerability is fixed. Now, if you have a population of 500 developers, you suddenly have one single person within the organization that has researched what cross-site scripting is, has found how to fix it in Java Spring. But what happens with that knowledge? Typically, that knowledge basically disappears into a black hole. That developer will either go on and do another job, and when the next cross-site scripting comes by, nobody knows that he fixed it, or he already moved on to another organization, and the 499 other developers in the team, they basically don't know what this bug is. And that's why bugs basically reappear all the time. Now, if you don't believe me, let's have a look on how the OWASP top 10, which of course everybody has heard about the OWASP top 10, let's have a look how this thing has actually evolved over the past 10 years. Now, on the left side, you can see this is the OWASP top 10 2007. Now, there is a 2003 version as well, but let's start with 10 years, 2007. We basically had injection flaws like SQL injection, XML injection as one of the top 10. We had cross-site scripting in there. We had IDOR, insecure direct object overruns. We had cross-site request forgery in there. Now, if you look at OWASP top 10 2010, the exact same vulnerabilities are still there. 3 years later, we move to 2013. They're still in the most common vulnerabilities on the internet. We then moved to the new version, 2017, that came out. And guess what? We still have cross-site scripting in there. We still have injection attacks in there. And basically, we still have a lot of vulnerabilities that are 10 years old and that are still one of the most common vulnerabilities out there. Now, not sure if you know this, but things like the injection attacks, SQL injection, and so on, cross-site scripting, they've been identified in 1999. We've been knowing the solution since 1999. It was actually in Frac magazine that SQL injection was first published, and Microsoft knew about it very quickly, and we've been known the solution for almost 18 years. But still, that knowledge sits in the security community and sits with those developers that have previously found one of those vulnerabilities and have fixed them, but it's just not generally known by most developers. And that is why most security knowledge goes into a black hole and disappears. So, but you can ask, well, why do we actually need to train developers in security? Yes, we have these bugs that are reappearing, but why is security even a developer's problem? Don't we have an AppSec team? Don't we have a security team within the organization that focuses on fixing security, whatever the developers has built? I must say, yes, that's what we've been doing in the past 20 years. Developers have been building their products, and we've attached security at the end. The AppSec team came in, did testing, did scanning, did pen testing, bug bounties, whatever you want, and then basically they reacted to those vulnerabilities and fixed them. Now, the problem with that is because we're moving into an agile environment where a developer wants to write code and wants to submit it the same day or even the next day, and you want to do 10 releases or maybe 20 or 100 releases a day, the system where we attach security at the end and where we're kind of saying, hey, security team, you are responsible for fixing the code, it just doesn't scale. It doesn't work, because for every 100 to 200 developers, you probably only have 1 or 2 AppSec guys, and they can never cycle as fast as those developers. They can't review or peer review every single commit to figure out, is there a security problem in or not. And people will say, yes, we're building out security pipelining, which will hopefully help. But at the moment, I think that technology of security pipelining and building in security checks at the right point is still in its infancy, and we still need to do some work to get the technology actually up to speed and working. So why am I a big advocate of pushing security skills to developers? Well, first of all, when you do that, they can fix flaws way faster. If they know about what a cross-site scripting is, they won't make those mistakes anymore, because they understand what good coding patterns are. They understand, what do I need to do to avoid writing, avoid writing those mistakes. The second reason is, you actually have developers that understand the basics of security. Well, they suddenly become your security army. They're going to be the defenders in your organization, and they're going to take responsibility to make sure that whatever they deliver, it's not only a feature that works, but it's actually a feature that works and protects the data and protects your customers, so they feel accountable and responsible for the output. So what we want to do is, we want to build a positive security culture. We want to make sure that developers and the security team, that they start liking each other, they start talking the same language, and that they start understanding that the only way forward is if developers and security people can work together and basically come to solutions together. Now, how can you change your approach on security training? How can we avoid putting out trainings out there that nobody wants to follow? Now, this is where gamification basically comes back into the picture. We've talked about action, reward, emotion, achievement, stage, and community. You need to take those concepts and you need to see, how can I actually apply this within my security training? As an example, instead of teaching the developers everything about security, what I recommend is, look at your results from your static code analysis tools, look at your result of your bug bounties, your pen testing, and figure out what are the top 3 mistakes of the recurrent bugs that we see coming back every month on our result, and take those top 3 and put those down as a baseline and say, hey, this year, in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months, we are going to focus on completely eliminating vulnerability A, B, and C out of our organization. And that A, B, and C will probably be very specific to the language and frameworks that are being used in your organization, but also the maturity and the state of knowledge of security in your development, and the kind of tools you've implemented. So, but figure out what are those top 3 vulnerabilities you have, and set that as a goal, saying, hey, developers, what I want you to do, I want you to take an action, and I want you to learn about those 3 vulnerabilities, for example, in a specific framework, in Java Spring, or in Java Enterprise, or in C# MVC. Now, the reason why I'm asking you to do it framework specific is because, yes, vulnerabilities like SQL injection, they exist, they could exist into every language. So they're available in every language. However, the good coding pattern to stop SQL injection, to stop those attacks from happening, is actually different from the frameworks you're using. So the way on how you're going to stop a SQL injection in Java Spring is going to be different than in Java Enterprise, is going to be different than in C# MVC, is going to be different than in Python, Django, or C++. And that is why I'm a big advocate of, hey, whatever training you give, you need to make sure it is in the language and it is in the framework that the developer is using, because else, if you don't do that, you just risk that your training will be generic, and your solution to an injection attack will be, hey, do input validation. And that doesn't help anyone, because input validation is so generic and it doesn't really give proper guidance. And what the developer is going to do is he's going to open up Google, he's going to Google saying, hey, SQL injection, input validation. He's going to end up on Stack Overflow. Somebody will find saying, hey, this is a solution I found to stop SQL injection in whatever language, and they're going to copy paste solutions, which we all know is probably not going to be the proper way on how you as an organization want to stop these kind of attacks. So step one, basically define the action that you want to do, but make the action short and specific, but also very relevant to daily jobs. Second thing you want to do is once they've completed the action, you want to make sure that they know there's a reward associated with that. And if you can say, hey, if you learn about these top things, for every module you follow, we're going to give you points, or we're going to give you a sticker, or we're going to give you a t-shirt, or we're going to give you a certificate, because many people, they care about having this little this paper, this certificate that says, hey, I know about security. And you can start building out levels. Baseline secure coding, level 1 ninja, level 2 ninja. So you can start building out a reward system that will give them something once they followed your action. Now, as a result, when you give them something, it's going to lead to an emotion. People like points, people like certificates. Many geeks, many developers, they like stickers, they like t-shirts. And the reason why they like them, because it gives them a sense of status. If I can walk around with a t-shirt in an organization that says, hey, I'm protecting the organization from SQL injections, or I'm protecting or I'm a secure code warrior like we do, it broadcasts to everyone else in the community saying, hey, I've achieved something. And the certificate will also lead to some kind of an achievement. You can even link that to performance objectives in the organization and saying, hey, if you actually want to achieve your objective this year, one of the things you need to do is you just need to look at that training that's going to take you maybe an hour, and it's going to teach you about the 3 most common things. So it's really important that if they achieve something, it is being broadcasted in a certain way, because recognition among peers is very, very important, not only to developers, but to security people and for everyone. Everyone likes to be recognized as one of the good guys. So to me, what we want to do is we want to make secure developers heroes, and we want to broadcast that in the organization and saying, hey, everybody that actually cares about the security of their code, we want to make you into a hero. So tips and tricks for effective training. First of all, use real code, use specific frameworks. Why using real code? Because they can relate to it. They can see real production code, and maybe it is vulnerabilities that you've identified in the past, and you can take them as samples. If you can't use real code for whatever reason, then please make it specific to the programming frameworks that they're using, because that makes the exercise relevant for them. Focus on the top 3 most common mistakes. You also have to adapt for the different levels in the organizations, because if you make your training way too hard, you're going to lose all the graduates and all the juniors. If you make it way too easy, seniors are going to come in and say, hey, I've known this stuff for years. Why do I need to spend my time on doing these things? So typically what you want to do is you want to adapt, and you want to have a senior go in, and he needs to feel he's not wasting his time by talking again about you can't store passwords without using a secure hash algorithm, because he already knows that stuff. So you need to adapt, and you need the exercises, you need the trainings to be relevant and adapted to the audience that you want to follow the training. And then the last thing, really important, is if they do it, basically reward and incentivize. Just to give you an example, we had one of our customers, and what they basically said to their developers is say, hey, we want you to spend one exercise every day in C#, and it takes 5 minutes to do that, and we want you to do that every single day for a period of 3 months. So it is something they can do at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, during lunch, or they can do 5 on a Friday afternoon, which will take them a half an hour. But that's what they basically ask. That's the action that they ask from their developers. Now, what they did is they had leaderboards on, and they basically broadcasted the results of the leaderboards at the end of every week. They broadcast it to the team, but they also broadcast it to the team members. So you could start seeing that the points and the gamification started pushing people into thinking about those exercises and into actually following them. Now, as a result, they measured what's the effect after 3 months, how much have we actually learned now, and what they could see is that there was a 60% drop in the vulnerabilities that were being written by that developer community. So by just doing 5 minutes of exercise every single day, they have a decrease of about 60% of the common vulnerabilities in the organization. So that kind of shows how powerful gamification and actions can really be, because vulnerabilities that are 20 years old that we haven't been able to eliminate for 20 years old, is you can get rid of them as long as you follow a strategy on how to make it engaging and interesting for developers. Now that kind of brings us to how do I think you should empower developers to code security? Tournaments. Now what that effectively means is that it's a way to me to create awareness. Why would developer really care about security? Well, first of all, put them in a room, play a tournament, make it global, give prizes out. We had some great examples of basically action figures that were being created, that were given out to join the tournament. These things are fun. It's something you can play in team. It's engaging. It builds skills. You can give out prizes, but more of all, you're making people heroes. And the effect that I've seen in tournaments is that executives are coming to watch. They're looking the leaderboards. The team leaders want their team to kind of win. So it has a really good effect in the organization. So with those tournaments, it raises awareness. It also increases their understanding. Yes, it's not really formal training, but at least it kind of makes them aware. It puts their attention on security and on secure coding. It will also give you feedback on who is actually engaging in the tournament. It will tell them how strong or how weak they are in this environment. And it's competition, and competition, and together with visibility to the organization, really helps to drive adoption. Now, the positive thing that we've seen out of this is that because typically AppSec or security is pushing these kind of an events, and if you have the right strategy and communication with it and it makes it visible, developers are going to engage in it, and it's actually going to start improving the relationship between the software engineers and between the security team, because suddenly the developers realize that these security guys are not all that bad. They're not always the ones saying no and stopping them, and they're actually organizing things that will improve the security culture in general, and they're doing it in a very fun and collaborative environment. Now, the second big benefit I've seen by running tournaments is that it allows you to identify security champions. Like, it allows you to find out who in my group of 500 developers would be ideal champions to kind of interface with. And I'll talk a little bit later about what security champions are, but this is a tool that allows you to figure out who is putting in the time, who is putting in the effort, who is going to get scores, who is helping other people during the tournament. And those are typically people you want to create a community of, and you want to grasp them, you want to really interface with them to make sure they form part of the security champion network. Another example, we had a customer here in Australia, IAG. They wanted to minimize security risks. They needed to upskill their developers. So what they've done is they've rolled out their own gamified program, and they basically were inspired by Games of Thrones, and they started to build games of code, or a games of code team, where they were printing t-shirts that were handed out to some of the developers. They had prizes, they had communication strategy, they had emails going out, and everybody knew about this game of codes program. From the executives to the developers, everybody heard about it, and it just created a very positive effect to improve the security culture among those software developers. And it basically told the developers, saying, hey, we as an organization, we really think that security is important, and we really want to help you becoming better. So they basically use tournaments and that gamified strategy to improve the awareness around their developers. Now, last thing I want to quickly talk about is also security champions, because those are your contact points in the organization. Now, there's a lot of talk around security champions, and I'm literally quoting somebody from Gartner here that said, hey, in 2021, there's going to be 35% of all the enterprises will implement a security champion program, because the amount of developers is increasing so rapidly within banking, within telco, within manufacturing. So there's so many developers being hired that the way on how security is currently being run with a centralized AppSec team doesn't really scale and function well. So you need to have points of contact within those developer groups, which we typically call security champions. Now, what's the role of a security champion? Well, first of all, he's the main, or he or she is the main point of contact for AppSec. So they kind of become the interface between the AppSec team and between the Scrum team, or between that basically developer team. Now, their job is to encourage developers to participate in brown bag lunch sessions, or to participate in tournaments, or to participate in trainings, or to read up on some of the incidents that, for example, have been happening in the past couple of months. These are all kind of news stories that champion can send around in his team to say, hey, this is really important. He can also keep his team up to date on what is the organization actually doing to improve security. What's the overall security program? Why should we actually care about security? And because he's part of the engineering team, people know him, people trust him, people will recognize him for being the supporting security person there. And one of the last and probably an important job as well is that if somebody identifies a security flaw, he's usually the person that's going to help the developer to find the knowledge, to find the way on how to fix this thing. And I think that person should also help the developer. If one developer basically finds a fix for a cross-site request forgery attack, he should be the one trying to distribute that knowledge within the rest of the organization, so that knowledge doesn't really end up into a black hole. Now, what's the ideal profile for a security champion? Now, first of all, they need to be people persons. To me, they need to be passionate about security, but I've seen many security champions that are not the biggest or most technical security expert. Very often, they're basically the complete opposite. They're typically the persons that they care about it. They might not be the experts, but they care about it. They're passionate about it. They participate in those sessions. They are willing to offer their lunchtime up to kind of present and help other people. They do research on those security things. They need to be people persons. They need to be good communicators. They need to be able to learn quickly, and they need to be able to respond to the recognition and responsibility. So typically, they're not a developer that has most free time. They're also not a person with best at security, and it also shouldn't be just a random guy, a random person that you choose in the organization and say, hey, from now on, you're going to be the security champion, because you want that person to basically be driving security into the developer community. Good. So that kind of brings us to the end. Like, what are some of the key takeaways that I want you to remember? Is that if you want to build a effective training program, what you should do is you think about what is the action that is relevant to the developer that I want them to take. What's the reward that is associated with that? And if I give this reward, what is going to be the emotion associated with that reward? Because the reward you can't just give out points and then the points disappear in a black hole and you can't really do anything with it. You actually have to associate something to that reward, and that could be achievement, that could be status, that could be part of a certain community, and that is really important to think about when you are building your training program. And the second point is around security champions. I don't see security working well in an agile environment where you don't have champions. So we should identify them. You should support them with material. And I think YAPSEC, they should empower security champions to kind of drive security within the developer community. Good. That's it. Back over to you, Jess.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. So if anyone would like to know a little bit more about that IAG Game of Codes case study that Peter mentioned, you can access it on our website at securecodewarrior.com. We also have a white paper and an ebook on the same topic that you can find there as well. So now we've got a few minutes left. Let's move on to a Q&A session. We do have a few questions that people have submitted in the question box. So Peter, I'm going to throw these over to you. The first one is, what do I need to do in order to run a tournament in my company?
So the key to success is basically to me, it's getting the buy-in from whoever runs your engineering or whoever runs your development, because if they're not willing to have an hour or 2 hours of the time of their developers to kind of spend on this thing, it's basically going to fail. So you can't expect to just send out an email and say, hey, we're going to run a tournament, everybody join on Friday, because that's not working. So you kind of need to brief their line management up front and saying, hey, what we want to do is we want to run a tournament. It's going to be this day. This is what we require, 1 or 2 hours. And the output is that we basically are looking for security champions that could be a part of a network, part of a community, so that we actually improve the code of your engineering, so that we don't end up wasting all that time with pen testing and bug bounties and all that kind of stuff. So getting buy-in is really important, and basically incentivizing on the tournament as well, giving the tournament visibility. I've seen really great tournaments where top executives in the company were actually attending the tournament at a certain point in time, or even giving a speech at the beginning of the tournament, just to give it some leverage and power in the organization to say, hey, this is why security and this is why you as a developer can help us build secure code, because it's really important for our organization. So to me, it's basically stakeholder buy-in, getting top management to also participate in the tournament, and make sure there is some rewards or incentives associated with the tournament.
Great. So right along those lines, someone would like to know, and I think you might have already touched on this, but just to reiterate, what are some appropriate prizes for this kind of tournament?
That is a really hard question to actually answer, because I've seen tournaments where people were giving out laptops and phones. Now, those are of course very, very, very expensive prizes to give, but it can drive people to actually attend. But most of the tournaments that we basically run is we will typically give something for participating, and that might be something small, like it might be a sticker that they can all put on their laptop. It's basically something to show, hey, you've participated in this thing, so here is something for you just to participate. Now, we also would typically give out for the top 10 people or the top 50 people in the organization, we would give out something which they can wear. It could be I've seen caps being used. I've seen t-shirts that are branded with the organization's name and say, hey, I survived a secure coding tournament or something like that. So you make it a very fun and an interesting thing by giving them a t-shirt. And I would typically give them visibility. I'm not a big fan of giving like financial rewards. Now, I've seen organizations do that, and it worked for their culture, it worked for their organization, but I would try and stay away from basically giving money to basically do your job or to participate in a tournament. So I would really keep it simple and give some small prizes, small incentives. But the most important thing is recognition to their peers, and recognition in the organization is being able to broadcast that you're the winner, that you're in the top 10 or in the top 15. That is really the key to as a prize in the tournament.
Great. Okay, next one. How often do you suggest running tournaments?
So this is another question which is very specific to the organization, right? Typically, what we see is that every quarter, there's going to be one tournament where everybody in the organization can kind of join. So once a quarter, you're kind of organizing this event where people can join. Now, that is just one example of how I've seen it be run. I've also seen where the security champions themselves, they can organize like mini tournaments in their teams, like which is only with like 10 or 15 people, and then at the end of the year there is this league basically going on, and it's going to be the champions of champions. So let's say you have 300 scrum teams in your organization of all 5-6 people. Well, they can all run mini tournaments at their own pace whenever they want, and then once a year you can pick the best person for every single team and basically run a more major tournament around once a year. So it really depends the time, the effort, the structure, the culture. Are your developers all in the same place? Are they globally spread? What are we going to do with the time zones? So there's no good answer to that question, but I can certainly give some ideas.
Gotcha. Thanks. Okay, next question. How long does a tournament run for?
Now, I've seen tournaments run for typically between 2 hours and 4 hours. So it's something that you probably need a little bit more than only lunchtime, because typically there's about 15 minutes, half hour briefing on what it's going to be, and at the end you want to have 15 to a half hour kind of doing the whole recognition part and taking pictures and putting people in a spotlight, reviewing the leaderboard, and then you certainly need to give them the time to actually dig into it. So I would say anything between 2 and 4 hours works really well if you are getting everybody at the same time to run a tournament, so they can all participate at the same time. I've seen other deployments where, because people are located or developers are located all over the world, the time zones make it difficult to really have 4 hours that is overlapping in China, India, the US, Australia, or Europe. So in those scenarios, I've seen tournaments, for example, run for a period of about 2 weeks. So that basically you send out, hey, we're going to start a tournament today, and the end is going to be 2 weeks later. And it's not that everybody has to participate or join at the same time, but in those 2 weeks they can basically join and start playing. The benefit of using that second approach is that you can actually figure out who is spending time in the evenings, in the weekends, and who is really getting into it, because that's the person that kind of wants to profile himself and wants to show him to the rest of the community that he's really good. So there's two approaches, and both of them have different challenges and benefits.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those insights, Peter. It looks like we're just about out of time. For anyone whose questions we didn't get to, we will have someone follow up with you directly to get you some answers. So thank you to everyone for joining us today, and a huge thank you to Peter for hosting.
Good. Thanks, everybody. It was really enjoyed to be able to do this webinar. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Have a great day.